Chapter 5 3 Sleuths. Hijacked, Nancy murmured in disbelief. Mrs. Pauling held the telephone receiver partly away from her ear so that Nancy and her friends could hear the rest of what John O'Brien was reporting. "I was towing the old stagecoach along a deserted road," he said, "when two masked men jumped out from among some trees and boarded the truck. They shut off the motor and dragged me to the ground. They bound and gagged me and left me in the woods. Then the two of them unfastened the tow chain and went off with the stagecoach." "How terrible," Beth said. "After they'd gone around a bend," the trucker went on, "I heard a motor start up, so I guess the men went off in either a car or a truck and took the old stagecoach with them. After a while, I managed to get free and drove along the road looking for them, but they were gone. I stopped at the first farmhouse I came to. It's called Brookside. That's where I am now. Mrs. Pauling, I'm mighty sorry about the whole thing. What do you want me to do?" "This is preposterous," Mrs. Pauling exclaimed. "It wasn't your fault, of course, John. Hold the phone a moment and I'll let you know what to do." Mrs. Pauling put her hand over the mouthpiece and consulted the girls. She said that she did not know what to tell John, but that she supposed someone should notify the police at once. "Yes," Nancy replied. "Why don't you tell him to do that, and please ask him to wait where he is. I'd like to dash over there and make a search of the area for clues." Mrs. Pauling nodded and requested the trucker to do this. Then she put the phone back into its cradle and gave a great sigh. By this time, Nancy, Bess, and George, eager to be off, were ready to say goodbye. When they reached the Brookside farmhouse where John O'Brien was waiting, they found two state policemen already talking to him. The trucker introduced the girls and told of their interest in the old stagecoach. John O'Brien then went on with his story. "Both the men who grabbed me were tall fellows. One had blonde hair, the other was dark. They didn't say a word, so I wouldn't recognize their voices." "Did you notice anything else that would identify them?" asked Officer Gavin. "Yes," John replied. "The dark-haired fellow had a slantwise scar across his left wrist, and the blonde man, I'd say, is either a sailor now or has been one. He tied me with nautical knots." "You sure were lucky to get yourself untied," remarked Officer Starr. "We'll radio in the full report right away and then start a search for those two hijackers." While the state trooper was calling from his car, John O'Brien told the other officer that Nancy was an amateur detective. Gavin smiled and asked if she had any theory regarding the theft of the old stagecoach. On her guard, Nancy smiled and countered with, "I understand there are a good many people in this area who are opposed to newcomers who are making changes and causing higher taxes. If this is true in Francisville, might it also be true regarding Bridgeford?" Officer Gavin looked at Nancy searchingly. Then his eyes twinkled. "Is that a genuine guess on your part, Miss Drew? Or are you keeping your real theory to yourself?" Nancy's only answer was a laugh. When State Policeman Starr finished his report, he suggested that he and Gavin start their search. "Do you mind if we follow you?" Nancy asked. "Not at all," Gavin answered. "But I suggest that you stay a fair distance behind us in case we run into any trouble." "I understand," Nancy replied. She climbed in behind the wheel of her convertible as Bess and George slid in from the other side. John O'Brien went back as far as the spot where he had been attacked. Then the officers excused him and he headed for Bridgeford. The wheel tracks of the old stagecoach were visible only as far as the place where John O'Brien had heard the motor start up. Here the troopers found crosswise marks in the dirt. Officer Gavin said they indicated that planks had been set up from the road to the rear of a truck. Apparently, the stagecoach had been pushed up this runway onto the larger vehicle and taken away. The tire marks of the truck were easily traced to hard surface road some distance ahead. Here they turned to the right. Then they mingled with the tracks of other trucks and cars. Presently, Officer Starr, who was driving the policeman's car, signaled that he was going to stop. Nancy pulled up behind him at the side of the road. He came back to speak to her. "We figure the old stagecoach was probably carried in a closed truck or van, but if it was an open vehicle, maybe someone can give us a clue. A quarter of a mile down the road, there's a new development. We're going to inquire at each house along the road for a mile to find out if anyone noticed the old stagecoach. If you girls would like to help, suppose you ask at the houses on the right side. Officer Gavin and I will take the left." Nancy was pleased to have the assignment and quickly accepted it. When they reached the settlement, she stopped in front of the second house on the right. George ran up to inquire at the first home, Bess to the third, while Nancy took the one in the center. None of the occupants answered their doorbells. The policeman had no better luck across the street, so the two groups of inquirers moved on down the road. The same procedure followed. This time, two of the residents were at home, but neither of them had seen an open truck with an old stagecoach on it. "Not a single clue," Officer Gavin said in disgust. After the mile had been covered, each group reported failure to learn anything. The policemen thanked the girls and said they would take care of further questioning themselves. "We'll be in touch with Mrs. Pauling to hear what you find out," Nancy told them. Turning her car around, the young sleuth started back in the direction from which they had come. George demanded an explanation. "I'm positive," said Nancy, "that those hijackers never came this far. It would be risky carrying the stagecoach for long on a public highway. I want to follow a hunch of mine. That is, the two hijackers went off this main road, taking the stagecoach with them. They may even have unloaded it and dragged it into the woods." George was inclined to agree with Nancy and added, "Which side road are you going to pick, Nancy?" "The first one those hijackers came to after they turned into the main road." When Nancy reached the woods road from which they had emerged a little earlier, she once more turned the car around, then drove very slowly. The three girls watched intently for a little used side road. They had gone scarcely 1,000 feet when Bess called out that she could see a trail through a wooded area. "It's probably a bridle path." Nancy had already stopped. Bess and George quickly stepped from the car and hurried into the woods. Within a few seconds, George called back, "I think this is the road, all right. Here are wheel tracks and footprints." Nancy locked the car, pocketed the key, and hurried after the cousins. The three excited sleuths almost ran along the bridle trail in their eagerness to find the old stagecoach. Suddenly, Bess stopped short. "We've gone far enough to prove our point," she declared. "I think we should go back and tell the state police. I certainly don't want to meet those hijackers." "I can't say that I do myself," Nancy replied. "On the other hand, we're only guessing that these wheel tracks belong to the old stagecoach. I think we should have more proof. Those hijackers may have taken the old stagecoach so they can hack it apart and find the clue. I'm convinced that Mr. Langstreet's secret has leaked out somehow. If we can possibly keep the antique vehicle from being destroyed, I'd certainly like to do it." "I would too," said George. "Come on." Bess followed reluctantly. Less than a quarter of a mile ahead, the girls found themselves at the edge of a treeless cliff. Here the bridle trail veered off down the wooded slope. The girls paused and looked toward the foot of the cliff. "There it is!" George cried exultantly. Below them was the stolen stagecoach, intact. It was lying on one side. "It isn't smashed, thank goodness," said George. "All those hijackers wanted to do was get rid of it. But why?" Nancy did not try to answer the question. She was not sure that she agreed with George. Bess again showed fear and insisted that the three girls leave and report to the police. "Let's split up," Nancy suggested. "Bess, you take my car key and go back for Officers Gavin and Starr. If you can't find them, get 2 others. George and I will go down this hillside and see what we can find out about the stagecoach." She handed the key to Bess. "I don't like this arrangement," Bess said, "but I'll do it. And please be careful." "We'll stay among the trees alongside the bridle trail just to make you happy," George promised her cousin. Bess went off, running at top speed. Nancy and George carefully descended the wooded hillside. On the way, they neither saw nor heard anyone. "I'd certainly like to get a close look at the old stagecoach," George whispered. "Do you think we dare?" Nancy suggested that they wait a few minutes. Then, if they saw no sign of anyone, they would go into the open and find out what they could about the overturned vehicle. 10 minutes went by. Complete silence. Nancy signaled to George that they would proceed. Just as the 2 girls walked up to the old stagecoach, a man's deep voice commanded harshly, "Stand where you are!" End of chapter 5.